So, as most of you know, I try to prepare a year's worth of Moot topics in advance so people know where they're at. And I've just completed the next year's list of possible topics. But this one I put in deliberately because um, if I trace my own reading back to those very early days of being a teenager and exposed to the writings of Aleister Crowley and books on the tarot and various people like that and the Golden Dawn, I came across the Theosophists. And although I know we've got a local branch of Theosophists in sort of Penzance way, I think it is, I've never been to a specific meeting of theirs, but I've got to say that some of the stuff I read early on that I understood, I've got to say it that way, some of the stuff I read and understood early on really did influence my particular thinking, but I also believe it will have influenced a lot of people who would now call themselves New Agers or neo magicians, even the neo pagan movement, which we can talk about in a moment. So, what is Theosophy? Simple, from the Greek, theos broadly meaning God or the creator, and Sophia meaning wisdom. So, Theosophy is wisdom about the divine nature of humanity and the universe, which is an interesting thing to explore. I know that I think I've explored in previous moots that my own journey took me into sort of mysticism very early on in my life, as a teenager and a quite, person who wanted to explore this stuff. Then doing a science degree took me out of it for a while, and then I was brought back into it because of an experience I had when I was in Canada. There's a story there which I may have told, but we'll leave it for now. But here's the thing for me, coming back to, let's call it mysticism, after being away from it and forcing myself to do the science, changed the way I approach things. So I revisited Theosophy and some of the writings shortly after that sort of reawakening, if you like, of my interest in the esoteric and the mystical. And dare I say that the word occult, I love that word, by the way, occult. I love the idea of being an occultist simply because A, there's a bit of shock value when you say it to people who don't get it. And the people who do get it realize that what you're really talking about is looking at hidden or mysterious things. However, I digress. Theosophy became a formal movement in 1875, and that's an interesting period of time, which we'll talk about in a moment. And the three main founders, although there's a bigger core of original founders of the movement, were these people that mentioned here: Alina Blavatsky, Henry Steele Walcott, and William Quan Judge. I thought I'd actually, that last one, I thought I actually misrepresented the name. I thought it was Judge William Quan, but no, it's William Quan Judge. And they founded the Theosophy Society in 1875 in New York City. And the idea was to bring people who thought in a similar way together and embody certain principles of exploring the divine or the wisdom of creative forces. And then shortly after that, 1877, Blavatsky released an incredible work called Isis Unveiled. And that's the book that, well, that's the books that I got into as a teenager. If I'm going to be honest, I didn't understand a lot of it. And if I'm honest now, if I look back at it, I still don't understand it, but it's not understanding it in a different way, which I'll explain. And then that was followed by a book called The Secret Doctrine. And they became the two key texts that Theosophists studied. And we'll look at those in a moment. We have to bear in mind, and I've mentioned this so many times before, that the social background of the 19th century saw this upsurge in interest in mysticism, occultism, magic, with a K if you want to do it that way, and esoteric traditions. We have the birth of spiritualism, we have the birth of spiritism, then spiritualism, we have the idea of alternative philosophies, the New Thought movement, which was basically a predecessor to what we call the New Age movement, perhaps, developed. The Industrial Revolution had an effect on people, and interesting, on people's thinking. We also had the Scientific Revolution in the 18th century, 19th century, and there was this sort of growing, I don't know, division of people that were trying to cling to some kind of religious belief system, but had got disenchanted with organized religions. And at the same time, there was a repopularization of Eastern philosophies. So we had Buddhism making an appearance and Taoism making I should say, reappearance, because they've been written about before. And the Kabbalah became another interesting interest of people. And of course, we know from other moots, this spawned groups like the Golden Dawn, who were an esoteric order, and their various spin-offs. So the social background is really important. And for me, it seems that at this time, this period in time, this period in history, there was a dissatisfaction with the material and an opening of inquiry into the spiritual and mystical. Now, that's always been there, but I think a bit like my own background, interested in mysticism, told I was going to be do science, put that stuff away, and then rediscovering it later. So I think I resonate with this period of time through my own personal history. Now, let's look at these interesting characters. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, who you may or may not have heard of. She was Ukrainian, and it wasn't Ukraine at the time. I won't go into all the politics around that, but she's technically Ukrainian. She had a very aristocratic background. She wasn't short of a penny or two. And she was largely self-educated, in the sense that tutors were brought in, but then she educated herself. I think she's a fascinating lady. She was very well traveled, and I put that or not so much. It is very difficult to separate out her own biographies from the biographies of other people, and whether her claims can be validated in terms of the places she went to. There's no doubt she traveled, and she came to England and went to America, and also claimed to have gone to Tibet and to be allowed into some of the more sacred inner sanctums within Tibetan monasteries. That's questionable, in the sense that at that particular time, foreigners didn't get into Tibet very easily. But, so she was either very well traveled or exceptionally well traveled. And then her self-education took her into this interest in Western mysticism, which is where I think she found a calling, in a way. And she claims to have met a number of spiritual adepts, both physical adepts, that's if people who are alive, people that understood the ancient wisdom of the East, and Tibet in particular, as well as spirit guides, I think that's the best way of putting it, who also taught her. And she's a fascinating lady. And a lot has been written about her. If you want to read more about her. There is probably as many apocryphal stories about her as there are fact-based stories about her. And for me, this soup of fact and fiction uh, is a really interesting one to sort of dip your bread into sometime. Excuse the food metaphor there. I don't know why I went that way. Henry Steele Olcott, another fascinating guy. He was an American military officer and he was a Freemason. As far as we know, he was the first American European to convert to Buddhism. And he wrote a lot on Buddhism. And he's really considered as a Buddhist modernist. He translated a lot of Buddhist teachings into something that we can understand in the West. In 1880, both he and Blavatsky were the first Western Buddhists to be, I think the word possibly isn't quite initiated, but welcomed into the higher rank of Buddhist teachers. So, whatever we say about them, they certainly put in a lot of personal development work and certainly studied their traditions. What was interesting about Olcott was that he did have a scientific approach to his studies. Uh, you heard me use the phrase rational mystic enough, and that's what I consider myself to be, I think. I consider him to be a rational mystic. He had his finger on the pulse of scientific development, and he had his sort of heart on the flow of Eastern mysticism, and could talk between the two and share between the two. And I think had a very balanced outlook. That doesn't mean he couldn't be swept away by the bit of pseudoscience here and there. We can all be swept away with that. But the fact that he tried to maintain an empirical approach to things that can't be questioned empirically. Yeah. And he wrote what became a very respected Buddhist catechism in 1881, which was really a Western version of a series of studies to become a Buddhist or to follow the Buddhist path, which in and of itself, if you understand anything about Buddhism, is an odd thing to say, because Buddhism isn't necessarily about education. It's more about opening up to other things. He was also a Freemason, and we've possibly explored in the past that Freemasonry, I think, and I think most people would agree, has a very mystical heritage. I think I described a Freemasons hall I went into very recently, and you could see it's the temple, the magic temple that many of the Golden Dawn wrote about, with the checkered floorboard and the two pillars. And obviously, of course, Golden Dawn members were initially Freemasons. Steele Olcott was interesting though, because he got interested in what became known as co-Freemasonry. And co-Freemasonry was an approach to the Masonic lodge idea in which women were allowed. It's kind of what the Golden Dawn were doing on the mystical side of things, because as we know, women were very important in the early establishment of the Golden Dawn. And if you missed that Moot, it's been recorded online, you can look at it. Now, William Quan Judge, yes, really interesting guy. He was born in Dublin, so he's an Irishman. His family emigrated when he was 13 to America, and he managed to pass the bar exam in New York State. So he wasn't, this guy wasn't daft. He became a lawyer in New York State when he was 21, or shall we say, was able to practice law in New York when he was 21. But his main interest and what he wrote lots and lots about was the esoteric and the occult. He was drawn to looking at the backgrounds of many esoteric traditions, looking at Hermeticism, which, we've talked about a little bit. And he was drawn to all of that. So these three people at this particular time were placed in a position whereby once they met, there was going to be a creative cauldron between them that they could actually start to synthesize some ideas. And it was these three people who attracted other people that were talking about the same thing, who were searching in the same way, and hence Theosophy was born. In its broadest aims, Theosophy Society, I would go along with these things. I think it's quite nice to have a group of people that form a universal brother sisterhood. I suppose these days it'd be themhood, or whatever you want to call it, without any distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or colour. That sounds great. And it was to study and get encourage the study of comparative religion, philosophy, and science. Again, that's right up my street, right? And then to investigate the unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in man, woman, them, her, it, whatever. There's three aims there that I think most of us here would, if not want to embody, I'd certainly be interested in the idea of a universal brotherhood, sisterhood, themhood, ithood, whatever, a study of philosophy, science, and religion, by that meaning spirituality, and to investigate nature in a way that says there's more than materialistic science can actually identify. Interestingly, what you're looking at there is the logo of the Theosophy Society, and it is full of symbols that you may be familiar with, you may have seen elsewhere, and you may see repeated in lots of other societies. There's the Audibus, which is a snake eating its tail, which again is a symbol of eternity. You have got the hexagram, six-pointed star. It's the integration of the elements amongst other things. If you go back to one of my very first moots, I talk about symbolism of these 5 6-pointed star. And in the middle is the Ankh, or the Ankh, which is the Egyptian singular of eternal life, and also the Christian cross. And then at the top within the circle is the spinning wheel. Now we probably recognize it as a swastika, but we also know that the swastika is an ancient Buddhist symbol with references to the paths of Buddhism. And their motto, there is no religion higher than truth, which I kind of resonate with. And in fact, when I came across this stuff mid-teens, it resonated with me greatly, because I thought, yeah, this is a group of people that are kind of interested in areas that I'm interested in. They're talking about truth as being an important thing, and they're talking about let's all get together, man. Very 60s, 70s kind of idea. So it resonated, and that's what caused me to read in the early teens the books Isis Unveiled, and recently Isis Unveiled, and I'm lucky enough that it's still in storage, but I do have an old copy of Isis Unveiled, which is I don't think it's worth anything, except it's worth something to me. So that's the Theosophy Society. It grew from its small New York chapter to having chapters across the world. And a bit like Freemasonry, that they've got chapters all over the world following a similar kind of path. I suspect a lot of Freemasons were pulled into Theosophy, as were some other spiritual traditions. People from other secret or fellowship societies would have been drawn to this. And I just realised Theosophy has got the O in the wrong place there. Apologies. Theosophy. Yeah. I hope it's spelt right elsewhere. So Isis Unveiled, let's just talk about that a little bit. Just to sow the seeds of something we can talk about a bit later on when I finish yakking. Blavatsky, who wrote this, saw this as the kind of the missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle that pulled together science and theology. She actually saw that as being the case. Published in 1877 with 2 volumes. The first volume was about psychic phenomena, the concept of inner and outer man, elementals, which harkens back to early magical traditions and trainings. Volume 2 was really about Christian scriptures, Buddhism, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, which is a very interesting religion, and the fact that she believed and Theosophists believe have a common source. Now, I think, without sounding disrespectful of any religion, we can see repeated themes within the world's major religions. And we do know that some of the stories that the Christian Bible has within it have parallels, if not the exact same story, going way, way back to Sumeria and the Epic of Gilgamesh. And this notion that everything is linked to some kind of common root makes sense to me. And all the different generations have done is retold the same story in ways that are relevant to themselves now. I saw an interesting post on Facebook this afternoon, it was, and it was from a druid, and identifying him as a druid, and was talking about, in a very intelligent way, the perceptions of ancient druidry and being a modern druid. And it's not about the robes, it's not about necessarily the rituals, and making the point that ancient druidry is nothing like the modern druidry that's practiced now. And that's as it should be, I believe, because we have moved on. And in fact, we're not really sure what the ancient druids did anyway, but there are lots of stories that we can build it on. But what I'm saying here is that each generation will adapt a truth that makes sense to them. I think I replied to this guy and tried to summarize what I was thinking on the moment, which is never a really good idea because I hadn't gone away and thought about it. But I kind of said that, I agreed with him totally, and that the symbols of the past aren't the symbols of the now. And I think the essence of Druidry has a lot of similarity to Jedi Knights in Star Wars, just that the reference points have changed. I know I've opened up a debate there. We'll come back to it later. Okay, so reception to Isis Unveiled was mixed, but it's often seen as a milestone in the history of Western history traditions. It pulled together central themes of Neoplatonism, the idea of how Plato thought about the world. It brought in esoteric Christianity, aspects from the Gnostic Gospels, what was known then. It brought in elements of cosmology, the science that we knew or was developing, growing. It brought in an understanding of evolution, albeit different understanding, and then a defiance of a purely materialistic science. And I think that's fair enough, because science can only ask certain questions. It's great at asking questions about things that can be reduced to simple observations and mathematical formula and extrapolations. It's not so good in answering questions like, what's the meaning of life? So there we go. So that's one side of how this book was accepted. But other people took a different view. They claimed that her research was shoddy, it was a pseudo history, wasn't really a history, she just extracted what she wanted to. It was a rewriting of existing esoteric ideas. And in fairness to Blavatsky, that's what she was trying to do anyway, bring all this together. But I love this quote by Henry Evans, who said it was hodgepodge of pseudoscience, mythology and folklore arranged in a helter-skelter fashion with an utter disregard of logical sequence. No wonder I couldn't understand as a teenager, and I still struggle with it now because it presents itself as being logical and ordered, and it's far from it when you try and read it. Um, and this quote by a guy called Jeffrey Hash: "It's comparative religion, occultism, pseudoscience, and fantasy in a melange that shows genuine, if superficial, research, and is not free from unacknowledged borrowing and downright plagiarism." Yeah, um, I guess, we have all been guilty of potentially plagiarizing stuff, but often we plagiarize it because we love it, and we've got to can't find a way of rewording it. Um, if you are my age, you may be familiar with a great comedian called Tom Lehrer, who just genius. But he wrote a song about plagiarize, plagiarize, let no one else's work evade your eyes. Um, and it's the degree to which we acknowledge stuff. And in today's AI world, by the way, it's even more difficult to spot the creativity from the plagiarized. Anyway, so Isis Unveiled was criticized, and it was criticized quite severely. In fact, one reviewer called into question Blavatsky's travels, particularly in Tibet, and particularly to being allowed into some of the higher echelons of Tibetan monasteries, and suggested that she did most of her travel writing and travel research while sitting in a library. May or may not be true. And I think this is where we need to question when somebody has an inspirational set of ideas and they're claiming they're from somewhere else. I think there's problems. If somebody says, I've got this idea and they share it with you, that's a different thing. However, The Secret Doctrine, her second book, was an attempt to elaborate on some of the things in Isis Unveiled. And this book I find as convoluted as the first book, but within it, she ties things down a little bit more. Volume one is all about the genesis of the cosmos, and she borrows the Hindu idea of cyclical development, which includes this idea of karma and rebirth until eventually it's the perfection of the soul or the spirit or of the individual. And in that sense, that's where the Buddhism link became apparent, because it's all about letting go of the illusion of now and aspiring to understand more of a genuine connection to the universe. Volume two, well, if you're going to talk about the history and the development of the universe, why not talk about the history and development of human races? And this is where I think things start to fall apart in her thinking for me, because at the same time she was competing with developments in evolutionary science, Darwinism, as well as trying to tie her theories of the development of the human being into what we were discovering more and more about the development of the spiritual human being. But she says that there are a number of root races. The ethereal was the first, that's the spiritual, the spirit, if you like. Then in Hyperborea, we'll talk about that in a moment, there's more physical form of human beings developed. And then in a place called Lemur, there was the first humankinds. And then type 4 humans, fully anthropoid, fully human, were developed in Atlantis. And the fifth root race is only 1 million years old. This idea that we're all descended from these races, which are all developments of each other, Of course, if you're trying to be purely scientific, as some people in Theosophy were, then the moment you mention Atlantis, you have problems. Lemuria, you may not have so many problems. We'll talk about in a moment. And Hyperborea, well, that's really the north. So we're there. So that was in the second volume. And she was trying to tie down the human development in the same way that she tied down the cosmic development to show there's a parallel. And in the Secret Doctrine, now these I think are quite interesting. There were these propositions that she made. You may recognize these from other traditions that have developed post 60s and became called other things like the New Age movement. But the proposition of the Secret Doctrine, there was one underlying unconditioned, indivisible truth. It is unknowable and undescribable. Well, that's exactly what the Kabbalists were talking about the origin. You can't describe it in words. It's exactly what I think some Buddhist teachings develop when they say you're trying to describe something in a language we don't possess. Yeah. It's in Sikh doctrine, the second proposition is that in this unknowable mass, everything in the universe was manifested in different degrees of life or energy or consciousness and matter. So within this unknowable, there was this evolution, development, expression of life, energy, consciousness, and matter. If you remember back to our talks on the Kabbalah and the Tree of Life, there's nothing new there from that perspective. The third proposition of the Secret Doctrine was that manifest existence is an internally recurring event. Now, I thought that should be eternally, which I think is probably more accurate, but she meant internally because it's going on at all levels. Okay. And then our souls derive from a universal oversoul, and souls are units of consciousness. When I was putting this back together again, it suddenly dawned on me where my simplification of the gloop comes from. This cosmic gloopiness and the bits of croutons and carrots within the gloop soup that make up all of us. And I'm sure without knowing that was the connection, revisiting these teachings made me think that's where this must have come from. And of course, the fifth proposition is the cycle of incarnation in accordance with karmic law. And karmic law, Hindu, Buddhist philosophy is highlighted there. Now, this is the bit that you may like to read and take a sharp intake of breath. Within the Secret Doctrine, she states this. Mankind is obviously lower human creatures. The intellectual difference between the Aryan and other civilized nations and such savages as the South Sea Islanders is inexplicable on any other grounds that these people are lower than other people. No amount of culture nor generations of training and civilization could raise such human specimens as the Bushmen, the Vedas of Ceylon, and some African tribes to the same intellectual level as the Aryans, the Semites, the Taurians, and so on. The sacred spark is missing in them. Wow. Okay, let's just take back a minute. Aryans are Indo-Europeans, not German Aryans in the same sense. Semites are those people from the Middle East. Turanians are the Middle Persian, Iranian peoples, of which Blavatsky is stating those four groups of peoples from those four geographical areas are fully human, and everybody else outside those areas is not. When I first came across this, when I first read it, I thought, hang on a minute, where does that statement of a universal brotherhood fit in to this? it doesn't. And this is the bit I read where I immediately fell out with Theosophy, and I may be accused of having taking her statements out of context. But for me, this really was what she's talking about. In fact, the South Sea Islanders and the Bushmen, I don't know about the Vidders, but some African tribes are far more aware of their environment and therefore I would say their spirituality than most of the Indo-European people that are living in the way that they are living. This bothered me. This idea of root race hierarchies started to bother me. I started to see how, again, of her time, other spiritual thinkers were beginning to make even more profound statements about who was human and who was not. Guido von List in Germany was developing his idea of the Aryan race, which was taken later by Hitler to justify his policies of eugenics. So this stuff is quite scary if you read it, and it's, for me, in total opposition to some of the early stuff about the brotherhood of man. One of the ideas that came with Theosophy, and I'll stop after this because I'm just bombarding you with lots of stuff, but was the idea of the seven rays or seven emanations. This is not unique to Theosophy because it pre-exists Theosophy, but was brought into more popular knowledge by the writings of the Theosophists, there being seven rays of development, there being seven challenges and trials of the human race. And the one that's most popular known is one that's written by a guy called C.W. Ledbetter, we'll hear about in a moment. But he talks about these seven rays as being emanations, of being radiations of how we as individuals can be developed spiritually and materially. And because Ledbetter was into yoga in a big way, yoga features quite a lot into this. But I find it's interesting. The first ray is will, the second ray is mind, the third ray is natural forces, the fourth ray is physical development, the fifth ray is magic, if you like, the sixth ray is altruism, and the seventh ray is invocation of spirits. Now, the reason this is important for me is we see this concept of seven rays repeated in almost every single spiritual New Age book written from the 1960s, 70s onwards. There are some very complicated developments of this idea in modern writings, but I think if we trace it back, this was an idea that we could possibly understand in the West because it translates into the idea of the rainbow, all right? And we know, I've spoken about it before, the idea of there being seven chakras in Western ideas of yoga is not what the Hindus wrote about, where this stuff of chakras came from. There are anything between 200 to 700 chakras in the Vedas, because it's about different aspects. But to the Western mind, who maybe doesn't access all the abstract teachings of the East, this suddenly becomes, there we go, it's a 7-step program, it's a 7-step development program, it's a 7-step this, that, and the other. And we see it repeated. Our chakras are 7 steps of awakening and development. And we ride the 7th wave or ray or whatever. And I'll let you think about where you've come across this before. And there's something else that Theosophy gave, a language they gave to the communities that have come since. and that is the idea of ascended masters, sometimes called the Great White Brotherhood. I have a problem with the Great White Brotherhood there, but the ascended masters. These were, according to theosophists, humans who were humans in past incarnations. So Jesus is a master of the sixth ray, and Sanat Kumara is a lord of flame, and Maitreya is the world teacher, and Kutumi is one of Blavatsky's primary guides, and Serapis Bey is the master of the ray of purity. You do a search for Serapis Bey, and you can buy all kinds of essential oils and and guru sweat that comes from Serapis Bey. I don't know where we take a metaphor and put it into something that is meant to be actual. Other enlightened ascended masters include Buddha, Lao Tzu, Saint Germain, Hamanotep II, Leonardus, that's the guy from Sparta, we are Sparta, Confucius, Mary Magdalene, Metatron, and you can go on there. What the Theosophists were saying is that this kind of court, board of directors, if you like, that are waiting to teach you, should you open yourself up to the ray or the path in which they are on. Now, for me, I'm got to be honest, this is where Theosophy lost me completely. I came across this initially as the Great White Brotherhood, which, having read that previous thing, made me tingle. And then the idea of the ascended masters. Well, I get the fact that there are people who have been enlightened and moved on. Buddha is the perfect example in my limited readings. But them being continued there to support you, or there as a signpost, possibly. The fact that they're sitting there waiting to leap into your aura to give you a squirt of a smelly stuff, Serapis Bay, I've no idea. But it bothers me, this concept, in some ways. The Ascended Masters, by the way, you do a web search for that, and the Ascended Masters is talked about in all kinds of ways now. They're aliens from other planets who've transcended the earthly coil. They're dolphins from the planet Venus who are masters of this and that. And for me, and I can't speak for everybody else, but for me, the moment you take a metaphor and extend it into a reality and then believe in the reality of the metaphor, there is possibly a problem. And many of those people who talk about ascended masters, I doubt have read Blavatsky or even some of the Hinduism roots of this idea. Just me? Now, a couple of other people that are really worth knowing about who were Theosophists. I can't deny that the Theosophy Society brought together revolutionary thinkers. It really did. And I think these revolutionary thinkers, well, I'll rephrase that. The danger is to look at Theosophy as a set of ideas and throw it all out because of a few things that Blavatsky wrote, when in fact it brought on a lot of other people. Annie Besant is a beautiful example. She was speaker, prominent speaker, women's rights activist. She was into Indian self-rule. She read Secret Doctrine and met Blavatsky, and she became a philosophist in 1890s. She even took over representing Blavatsky when she died in the subsequent World Fair. She took Theosophy in a different direction slightly, I think. She was actively involved in human rights movements, and she was a very powerful woman. I think she's one of those women that isn't spoken about enough when we talk about influential women of the past. And I think the reason she's possibly excluded is that she is seen to be a bit flaky because she developed clairvoyance. And I can see how the establishment would actually look at that idea of clairvoyance in a very cold, blinkered way and think that this woman was a bit off the wall. But I think she had a lot of great ideas and she brought a lot to the human movement, and in fact started to espouse that idea of, the humanity, that core human values. I'll mention this in a moment. Clairvoyance is an interesting word, as are any form of the clairaudience, clairsentience. Clair means clear. Voyance, the word after that, is what you're clear in. So you're seeing clearly, you're hearing clearly, clairaudience. Clairsentience, you are sensing other people and other presences clearly, and so on. If somebody was to call me a clairvoyant, I wouldn't immediately go down the route of psychic ability. I go down the route of, well, I'm looking at things logically and seeing them clearly. Yeah. And it's a shame that the word clairvoyance has been hijacked in a way to immediately link it to the person who stands on stage at a psychic fair and gives readings. Now, I know I'm not knocking those people, certainly not, but I'm saying that clairvoyance has a broader, more lovely meaning than the narrow meaning that we often take it for today. As when I talked about spiritism and spiritualism a few moots back, spiritism means one set of things, and I'm kind of interested in that. Spiritualism means another set of things, and I'm not so interested in that. That doesn't mean I'm right, doesn't mean I'm wrong, it just means that's where my interests are. But Annie Besant, well worth looking up if you don't know anything about her. The guy I've already mentioned, Charles Ledbetter, the one who did the 7 rays descriptions, well, he was really interesting. He's born in Stockport in Cheshire. He was a priest in the Church of England initially, but his interest in spiritualism created a problem, created an issue. So he left the clergy and started to write prolifically about spiritual things, yoga being part of them. He met Blavatsky in 1884, and he travelled with Henry Steele Alcott to Ceylon, and he started to work with Annie Besant. So he met all of these wonderful people that we've been talking about. And therefore, as a guy that I think was an intellectual, he wrote 40, 50 books or so on these topics. So he was able to synthesize some of the knowledge and possibly share it in a less controversial, more interesting way. But in 1909, he met a 14-year-old lad who the world came to know as Jidar Krishnamurti. More about him now. Krishnamurti, you may or may not have heard of, but if you've heard of them, he was a respected spiritual teacher. The Theosophy adopted him at 14 because he had the aura of a teacher. And at that particular time, the Theosophists were looking outward to see if they could find a world teacher, a teacher that would take the spiritual evolution of humans to the next level. And so by 1911, and it was actually Ledbetter who noticed this aura within Krishnamurti. By 1911, they set up the Order of the Star of the East, which was a separate order within Theosophy, which was to prepare the world teacher to meet the world. Yeah. And that's sort of, he was really, okay, you could say trained, you could say indoctrinated, you could say informed in Theosophist teachings and absorbed that stuff. But by 1929, he became disenchanted with Theosophy and walked away. And so the Order of the Star of the East never got off the ground, and the world teacher the Theosophists were searching for just didn't appear. His teachings, however, influenced a generation. One of the spiritual writers that I really like is a guy called Alan Watts. And Alan Watts attended lots of Krishnamurti's workshops. He was encouraged to think in that way. And this quote is from Krishnamurti. I love it. Attempt without effort to live with death in futureless silence. Death is the end of all you are afraid to lose, your attachments, your memory, your disappeared friends, your prestige. All is the content of your consciousness. Get rid of it right now. If you know any Buddhism, you know any Taoism, that's pure statement of the Taoist ideas of walking the way without resistance, and also the Buddhist idea of attachments and the Eightfold Path. So Krishnamurti is interesting. What I find fascinating, he was raised as the Theosophical Society's world teacher, taken from his parents, kind of adopted, and then lavished all this stuff upon him, and then within a number of years was disenchanted with what Theosophy is a whole, and walked away from it, actually dissing it. Now, Krishnamurti, despite some of the wonderful, and I think this is the problem with all sages and teachers and prophets throughout the ages. You know, they say these wonderful things about attempt without effort to live with death. They say these wonderful things, we quote them, but actually maybe their real personal lives were not particularly brilliant. Krishnamurti's wasn't as brilliant as some of the followers would like to make out. He had his shady side, as we all do, and number of affairs and that kind of stuff. And so he wasn't actually golden innocence, but he was a thinker and a speaker. And I think sometimes people can say things and they move us and our awareness further. Out of the mouths of fools and babes comes inspiration. But that's Jiddu Krishnamurti, and you've probably heard his name because he's bounded around esoteric circles with a high degree of reverence. So, to end this sort of diatribe, Theosophy, what is it? Well, it's borrowed from a wide range of Eastern traditions, Hinduism and Buddhism, particularly, but also Taoism. And it was an attempt to create a single spiritual viewpoint, a synthesis. I have no problem with that idea. In fact, all religions and religious movements have tried to do that, bring together and synthesize their teachings into a coherent, teachable path. The church, the Christian church, is a perfect example. I think it was a growing, confident, and potentially racist doctrine, or was it? I still question all of that. It had a group of charismatic leaders with a con story, perhaps, or they were just charismatic. Its elements of profound truth within 19th century verbiage. While you try and read Isis Unveiled or Secret Doctrine, you may agree with that. You have to look behind the limits and the language of the culture. Is it an enlightened approach to understanding who and where we are? I think it was an attempt, personally. I think it was an interesting attempt. And in fact, preparing this evening set of slides, I am tempted to re-look at Theosophy again and dig a little bit deeper. However, what we can't deny is it actually has a major influence in New Age philosophy and teaching. The sad thing for me is many New Age gurus that we maybe have met or come across are not rigorous enough to understand where their thinking or ideas came from in the first place. And it's one of my bugbears, really. It's okay to stand on the shoulders of giants and share your ideas that have been developed by the people of the past. I think it's disrespectful to assume that you've come up with it all on your own and through your own heightened spiritual awareness. And I've been to enough New Agey festivals to know that there's a group of people that actually fall into that category. Um, whereas true philosophy and true learning is about understanding where ideas come from in order to shape them and make them relevant for this generation. So I think you open any New Age book, any, from New Age versions of magic to New Age versions of Druidry or Wicca or whatever you open, you will find a smattering of thoughts that trace back to the popularization from Theosophy, which their thoughts trace back to much ancient Eastern ideas um, embedded within the system. And I think it's worth honoring all of that.